HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Making of Black Lives Matter, A Brief History of an Idea, 2nd edition, by Christopher J. Lebron, read by Diontae Black. People can't, unhappily, invent their mooring posts, their lovers and their friends, any more than they can invent their parents. Life gives these and also takes them away, and the great difficulty is to say yes to life. James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room. Introduction to the Updated Edition. An introduction for the 2nd edition of a book like The Making of Black Lives Matter, A Brief History of an Idea, is a less straightforward thing than it might first seem. Typically, when an author revisits a book some years later, their ruminations center on how they may have become clearer on the ideas in their book, taken into consideration critical corrections, or, maybe, generally how their own thinking has matured, thanks to the miracle of living a life. But as I sit here, toward the end of 2021, experiencing a late fall in which the leaves seem to refuse to quit the trees, I am reflecting in the midst of an entirely different set of considerations. As the first edition of this book was going to press, an unapologetic, racist, misogynist, homophobe, and xenophobe had slid through the safeguards of democracy meant to keep people of low morals out of the most powerful position in the world. Some thought, sure, Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote, even as he lost the popular vote, but the structure of major institutions would train, coerce, persuade such a man to become a proper president, a responsible custodian of all Americans' welfare. But you cannot train a person who denies the power of knowledge, cannot coerce a bully, cannot persuade someone motivated by irrational animus toward anyone who disagrees with them. And then, as if the real erosion of what passes for democracy in America in the face of clumsy, intellectually bereft demagoguery were not a historical emergency all on its own, the globe was beset by a life-threatening pandemic 3 years later. COVID-19 took nearly 1 million American lives as the same president suggested we inject ourselves with bleach, while declaring that science had no more idea of what was happening than the average person on the street. Indeed, the bare idea of wearing a slim piece of cloth over one's mouth to protect others from a deadly disease was enough to enrage him and his quite substantial and immovable base. In the midst of this most recent catastrophe, America was reminded that blacks have been suffering catastrophe since we were dragged to North America. In the summer of 2020, another police officer with no patience for the idea of black humanity casually placed his knee on another black man's neck while looking at the surrounding crowd, befuddled that anyone could disapprove of casual racial murder in public. Under that knee, George Floyd took his last breath, and America held its own. Because this time was different. We had all been forced into varying states of idleness in the midst of two horrors, the Trump presidency and the COVID-19 pandemic. And this last horror, this public execution, seemed one too many traumas for us to process. The nation erupted in widespread angry protest. Importantly, white Americans turned out in record numbers supporting the movement and/or the idea Black Lives Matter. It seemed we were at a turning point. It seemed as if white Americans finally got it. Except, not really. Soon what had first appeared to be unalloyed white support for Black lives became something of a spectacle centering on white and other non-black protesters as they complained of various indignities, co-opting media attention in the process. The case of Naked Athena is an example that is as astounding as it is baffling. Athena, an apparently white protester, though someone claiming later to be Athena described herself simply as non-black, positioned herself naked, legs splayed, sitting on a street in Portland, Oregon during the protests in an area occupied by police. Her reason, according to a person claiming to be Athena, my message, other than my feminine response of wanting to show them what my version of vulnerability looks like, was we're all out here, these protesters, and the only thing we have in common is we have masks on and we're out here at night. A statement I am sure George Floyd's family would have a hard time endorsing. And then public opinion support for Black Lives Matter, which had been at an all-time high when the protests began immediately following Floyd's murder, plummeted from a high of 52% of respondents to 43%. Commentators began to reasonably suggest that a lot of white support was in part a function of COVID boredom. White Americans had seen a horrific thing with not much else going on in their COVID-isolated lives, and, without a job to go to or the ability to see friends otherwise, took to the streets. But the solidarity was somewhat illusory. Undoubtedly, a lot of these people were genuinely upset at what they saw on that TV or computer screen, but under any other circumstances, they would have merely been troubled, and their lives would have gone on uninterrupted. But during the height of the pandemic, neighbors who had never once mentioned to me a concern for racial justice were enthusiastically recounting their participation in a recent local march and planning on how to avoid contracting COVID while participating in the next. Since then, however, with the world hobbling toward normalcy and Trump out of office, I've yet to hear one of them say another word about racial justice or see any one of them take a civic-minded action in support of Black Lives Mattering. The style has passed. Though many Black Lives Matter lawn signs persist, sun-bleached and fading. The past 4 years have taught two exceedingly important lessons with which anyone truly concerned with Black Life Mattering must seriously contend. First, the rise and staying power of Donald Trump's racial nationalism indicates not something wrong with him, which surely there is, at least with his morals in any case, but with this nation. As became increasingly common to note, Trump was a symptom, not a cause of this nation's tragically anemic inability to reliably and robustly express concern for non-white citizens, especially those not straight and male. Trump roused a large and enduring portion of the electorate, barely bothering to veil that with him at the lead, the nonsense of showing compassion to blacks, women, queers, immigrants, non-Christians would come to an end. Trump did not create these beliefs. His only innovation was a market one. Who else was out there as a national politician unapologetically courting resentful whites and making it sound like this made him the greatest American patriot of the 21st century? Very few. Trump, with not much to lose, simply removed the veneer of coded language from Republican politics and injected them with righteous fury. A hateful political star was born on the winds of that which was blowing through America for the past 4 centuries, racial fear and resentment. Second, what is the true state of our nation's commitment to systemic racial change beyond the difficulties the far and alt-right present? In concordance with the largest amount of white support for racial justice the nation has ever seen, radical institutional solutions seemed truly possible. Prominent among these was the call to defund the police. This slogan was less fortunate than Black Lives Matter, for it seemed a blanket brute force call for simply getting rid of police, when in fact there were more practical and elegant proposals as part of the movement, such as redirecting funds to positively diversify police and civic resources. For example, if today you were to notice a homeless individual acting erratically, it is likely that the first line of encounter such a person would be with armed law enforcement, rather than a trained mental health professional whose first and main aim is to de-escalate without presenting a mortal threat. Such legislation promised to humanize public safety and made it onto some major state house legislative agendas, only to mostly fizzle at the same time as popular white support for Black Lives Matter. Crucially, Such deflated ambition not only calls into question who we are as a nation, but asks, realistically, what are our possibilities to be greater than we have ever been on the count of racial justice? This general phenomenon is the flip side problem of Trump having merely been a symptom of our nation's worst vices. The answers have been less heartening than hoped, especially once one considers that our Democratic savior from Donald Trump, Joe Biden, was himself directly responsible for the 1994 crime bill. This legislation was instrumental in the expansion of police presence, power, and resources that has led to all the black deaths we mourn today and will, in all likelihood, continue to mourn until we achieve, if we can achieve, our better selves. It is with these thoughts in mind that I offer a framing for the new chapter that is now a part of the making of Black Lives Matter. When I wrote the first edition of this book, I was keen to enter the conversation of the movement on an intellectual level, and that presented certain consideration for the book's scope. My one lingering question for the book was, what if I extended the story of the intellectual girding of Black Lives Matter into the Black Power era? As it stood, the book's journey ended in an important, but also orthodox, maybe even predictable, moment with James Baldwin and Martin Luther King Jr. In one sense, this was fitting as it closed out on a more positive note, the civil rights trajectory that began in the book with Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells. But in another sense, this left readers in an inconvenient place because crucial questions arose right after Baldwin and King's moment, precisely because there was a kind of backlash to civil rights from both white institutions that reinvented modes of domination, for example, the modern rise of a very robust police state, and from black activists who maintained, following the temperamental lead of Malcolm X, that the civil rights victories were thin and the movement required more radical propositions. While blacks could vote, they could also be beat by the police more, and while there was some integration, black was still not beautiful or proud. Thus, the late 1960s into the 1970s gave rise to the Black Power movement in all its manifestation, black arts, the reclamation of African-inspired aesthetic, and so on. There were important lessons to be drawn that did not make it into the first book. But what would I do now with a chance to make this contribution in a second edition? The answer was to work from the core of Black Power concerns, but this time making less obvious yet no less foundational choices in my conversation partners. The obvious subjects for such a chapter would have been Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party for self-defense, along with Kwame Ture / Stokely Carmichael. But that choice introduced challenges of its own. First, and importantly, it threatened to problematically disrupt the gender balance I had worked to establish in the first edition. A very reasonable objection to the Panthers was their strong commitment, explicitly and implicitly, to masculine ideals of leadership and attitudes for most of a party's brief existence. And then, if I paired them with Torre, that would have made the issue of gender balance even more tenuous. Thus, I chose the pairing of Angela Davis and Amiri Baraka. I want to say a few words on why I chose them, the challenges they present, and then ultimately, the powerful contributions they make in considering the matter of black lives in a post-Trump America. There are 3 reasons for choosing Davis and Baraka. First, in important ways, they mirror each other. Their lives and activism overlap historically, thus they were responding to very similar, sometimes the very same events in their writings, but from their distinctive vantage points. For example, while Davis, on the West Coast, was confronting the Soledad brothers' trial and threats from rival factions within the West Coast Black Power movement, Baraka was dealing with the reverberations of those rivalries as he sought to build robust black institutions in Newark, New Jersey, in hopes of shaping a mayoral race. Second, both thinkers left copious writings. This is a deeply important factor when covering the ideas of historical figures. It makes tracing the core concerns in their thinking and activism, as well as their maturation over time, much easier and precise. That said, in the case of Davis and Baraka, there is more work than can be attended to in one brief chapter, which leads to the third reason they make a great pairing. They had complementary views and deep interests on the relationship between jazz as a black art form and the political valences of black life. I will have more to say about this coming up. It is worth noting some challenges in dealing with the work and lives of Davis and Baraka. For Davis, the conceptual depth as well as analytical consistency of her work is of varying quality, spanning a significant range of time as well as subject matter. A virtue of her early work is that her training as a philosopher shows through with a fair amount of consistency, making her earlier work more reflective and probing in ways her later work does not quite match, and this is not an insignificant concern for a book of this nature. Baraka presents more substantial challenges. He had problematic views concerning gender and homosexuality. In predictable ways, he mirrors a very black masculinist view common to prominent male participants in the Black Power movement. He seems to have become more recalcitrant and softer in these views in his later life. This is unfortunate because it is his earliest work which, ironically, is most useful for us. No apology can or should be made on Baraka's behalf. Yet, at the same time, I want to resist the recent trend in throwing out the thinking we like with the thinker we don't. We can find value in writings that exceed the personality in question, and that is what I intend on doing. We need not accept homophobia or misogyny to appreciate the power of reclaiming certain readings of the history of black art that point the way toward cultural emancipation. And that is what I intend on doing. This brings us to their contributions. One understanding of Black Lives Matter is a slightly conservative one where the demand is simply that whites acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. But there is more to it than this. The slogan is also meant to be transformative of a nation and its citizens who benefit regularly from white privilege and or practice or embrace or passively accept white supremacy. But Black Lives Matter is also an inflection point for Black Americans, a way of dealing with the age-old problem of figuring out what it means to be black or brown in America. Such questions center the theme of becoming. What are the imaginative horizons for creating a self? What resources are available to Black and brown Americans? What limits and obstacles seem to exist? How do we push past those limits and remove those obstacles? These questions introduce a deeply emancipatory program into Blacks' lives so long as there is an attendant consciousness. This is where Davis and Baraka are helpful. Both Davis and Baraka grew up in mid-century America, where anti-Black violence was common, but also, on the horizon, were those fighting and slowly proving that whites did not need to hold, in fact had no right in determining the possibilities of Black life. Both Davis and Baraka bore witness to and were victims of racial violence, including from police. Both bore witness to the immediate aftermath of a cultural epoch of the Harlem Renaissance, and both were present for important amendments to that moment. Significantly, for Davis and Baraka, in their distinct but closely related ways, the blues and jazz were art forms that spoke without apology to the theme of becoming. As I shall discuss in the chapter, both saw the blues and jazz as not only the rightful cultural heritage of Black Americans, but as an art form that was born of a particular socio-political existence, beginning in slavery and evolving to meet the times of a Jim Crow and, later, a post-civil rights America. The blues, as Langston Hughes intimates in Chapter 2, was a politically expressive art form, and as Davis puts it in Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, emerging during the decades following the abolition of slavery, the blues gave musical expression to the new social and sexual realities encountered by African Americans as free women and men. Blues was a genre that seemed to anticipate an era when Blacks could express full civic autonomy by first suggesting full personal autonomy in the music. As we will see, Davis properly credits black women blues artists with leading the charge into the American imagination through the power of their artistic vision, combined with the unapologetic manner in which they owned their womanhood, sexuality, and blackness. Baraka's story of the blues delves into a different aspect of black history and is more archaeological, as it were, in its statement of the relationship between the blues as a living artifact of African culture and American blackness. In Blues People, he writes, "Blues did begin in slavery, and it is from that peculiar institution that blues did find its particular form. And if slavery dictated certain aspects of blues form and content, so did the so-called emancipation and its subsequent problems dictate the path the blues would take." Despite their distinctive emphasis, Davis and Baraka each, in their own way, motivate what I want to suggest is a fitting closing thought for this volume. What should be the stance of Black Americans toward themselves, as well as toward the nation as we consider whether America can and will ever become the version of itself imagined by the founders? Through their readings of blues and jazz, which inform their own activism and writing on prison abolition and community organizing, Davis's and Baraka's answer seems to be this: we should not seek to be great Americans, but rather seek to become free people in the deepest sense, despite America, not because of America. And in doing so, yes, we help America achieve its best self, but we ensure that we become proper selves in the first place as we come to possess our humanity and embrace resistance to any threat to that humanity. Davis writes, "The first condition of freedom is the open act of resistance." The Black Lives Matter movement has taken this sensibility to heart. Between the date of the original publication of this book and the time of this writing, the list of unarmed blacks killed by police and civilians has only continued to grow. We can honor the fallen dead with memories, but the way to honor the living is through resistance, so that future generations can possess memories free from unnecessary tragedy. This is the new American dream. Introduction to the first edition, Naming the Dead in the Name of the Living. It can be difficult to keep up. I've published one previous book, numerous papers, essays, and book reviews in a wide range of outlets, both academic and public, and have another book manuscript well in the making. And every time I begin at the beginning, I always write an introduction first. The introduction is what has typically guided the vision and framework for whatever follows: op-ed, essay, book review, book. That has been my own conventional wisdom. When I began working on The Making of Black Lives Matter, A Brief History of an Idea, I knew I couldn't write that way. Though this is a book of intellectual history, its motivating moment is a dynamic one. I hoped beyond hope that in the year or so it took me to write it, the fatal conditions in America that moved me to write the book in the first place would allow me to qualify with a ray of optimism the somber reflections that follow. But I also knew that things might change very little, or possibly get worse. I intentionally saved the introduction as the last major piece of writing for this book. The result? Just 1 week prior to my sitting at my computer to write these words, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were killed by Baton Rouge and Minneapolis police respectively. We must add their names to the dead in the name of the living. Oscar Grant, Sharice Francis, Rakia Boyd, Kendrick McDade, Tamon Robinson, Chantel Davis, Jonathan Farrell, Jordan Baker, Mackenzie Cochran, Eric Gardner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, Ezell Ford, Kajime Powell, Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice, Dontre Hamilton, Betty Jones, Roy Nelson, Tiara Thomas, Alonzo Smith, Anthony Ashford, Tyree Crawford, Samuel DuBose, Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, Natasha McKenna, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. This list is far from complete. In fact, it's short by hundreds of names that are of a damning evidence of the level of violence against black bodies in America. What you might find shocking is that the hundreds of names missing do not span a century or even decades of American history. Rather, the list I provided begins in 2012, and it is missing the one name we might look back upon from some future vantage point as the most important in the history of today's racial struggle: Trayvon Martin. The story of a movement that seeks to redeem a nation begins with Martin. The evening of February 26, 2012, Martin was walking through a Sanford, Florida community, wearing a hoodie and holding only a soft drink and some candy. George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, deemed Martin suspicious and called the police, though Martin had not actually done anything actionable. His only possible crime seemed to be walking while black. Though advised by the 911 operator to stand down and keep his distance, Zimmerman initiated a confrontation that resulted in a scuffle that ended with him shooting 17-year-old Martin dead. Despite Martin's younger age, weight and size disadvantage, and the all-important fact that he was unarmed, his character quickly became the center of speculation and conversation. He was a black teenager wearing a hoodie, walking through someone else's neighborhood. If Zimmerman suspected him, he must have been suspect-worthy. It came as a surprise to some in America when, in the summer of 2013, Zimmerman was found not guilty on all charges related to Martin's death. It was at this moment that Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi made history. As Garza states on the website bearing the movement's name, I created #Black Lives Matter with Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, two of my sisters, as a call to action for black people after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder, and the killer, George Zimmerman, was not held accountable for the crime he committed. Thus, it was the death and failure of our justice system to account for the unnecessary death of a black American that prompted three women to offer these three basic and urgent words to the American people: Black Lives Matter. Today, #Black Lives Matter has become a force demanding change in America. Eschewing traditional hierarchical leadership models, the movement cannot be identified with any single leader or small group of leaders, despite the role Cullors, Tometi, and Garza played in giving us the social movement hashtag that will likely define our generation. Rather, #Black Lives Matter represents an ideal that motivates, mobilizes, and informs the actions and programs of many local branches of a movement. Much like the way a corporate franchise works, minus revenue and profit, #Black Lives Matter is akin to a social movement brand that can be picked up and deployed by any interested group of activists inclined to speak out and act against racial injustice. There is no doubt that the movement itself is historically momentous, even if it remains unclear as of this writing the level of policy efficacy #Black Lives Matter has been able to bring to bear on the problem of racial justice. Indeed, it is precisely because of a nascent and formative status that I resisted writing directly on the movement. I did not, nor do not, as of this writing, perceive a space or opportunity to say something sufficiently systematic and helpful about the movement on which so many black Americans are pinning their hopes. Yet, there is something undeniably powerful about those three words: Black Lives Matter. Yes, it is true that they were brought into our political existence at a moment marked by tragedy and unjustifiable losses of black life. That alone makes those three words a touchstone for our American lives today. The struggle to insist that black lives are indeed lives and therefore not candidates for cursory or careless or hateful or negligible elimination. The problem, as I saw it from the perspectives of a citizen, a black Latino man, and a scholar, was to honor the moment in which we find ourselves, at the helm of which is a movement that seeks to finally undo this nation's murderous racial history. This is a history that spans and reaches like a weed across centuries. Indeed, the only way I think, to appropriately reflect on this moment that seeks once and for all to place Black Americans on a level of human equality with whites is to treat the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement as intelligent, enduring, and politically savvy. As a trained political philosopher,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?